The monitor flatlined at 11:42 a.m., and the lead surgeon's body hit the floor before anyone in the room had time to think. There were 6 people in operating room 3 at Hargrove Memorial Hospital that morning. 5 of them had medical degrees. The 6th was a 23-year-old man named Tobias Annan, and he was supposed to be mopping the hallway. He had been doing exactly that, pushing a yellow mop bucket past the ore wing, headphones around his neck, a worn-out pair of sneakers squeaking softly against the linoleum, when the doors burst open, and a scrub nurse named Patrice ran out with her mask pulled down and her eyes wide. "Someone call a code," she was shouting. "Dr. Fenwick is down!" Tobias stopped. He looked through the small rectangular window in the OR door. Inside, he could see the body of Dr. Paul Fenwick, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Hargrove Memorial. 22 years of experience. A man whose hands had repaired more than 3,000 hearts, crumpled on the floor beside the operating table. On the table, a 61-year-old man named Arthur Greer lay open-chested, his sternum retracted, his heart beating weakly and exposed to the air. The bypass machine hummed. The anesthesiologist stood frozen at his station. The 2 surgical residents in the room looked at each other across the table, like 2 people realizing simultaneously that neither of them knew how to swim, and they were standing at the edge of a very deep lake. Tobias watched all of this through a small square of glass, and then he pushed open the door and walked in. Nobody noticed him at first. That was the thing about being a janitor in a hospital. People looked through you the way they looked through windows. You were functional, transparent. The scrub tech was trying to keep the surgical field sterile. One resident, a young woman named Dr. Sasha Croft, was pressing gauze against the patient's chest and repeating, "Okay, okay, okay," in the tone of someone trying to convince themselves of something that wasn't true. The other resident, Dr. Emmett Burke, had picked up the phone on the wall and was talking fast and low, calling for the attending backup. The bypass machine beeped once, then twice, then in rapid succession 3 times. Tobias moved to the machine without hesitation. "Hey!" Sasha looked up. "Hey, what are you? Who are you?" "The flow rate's dropping," Tobias said. He didn't look at her. His eyes were on the console. His hands were already at the controls, not touching them yet, hovering just above. "Your venous line has a partial kink somewhere before the reservoir. You need to check the tubing at the inferior cannula." The room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when something happens that has no category yet. Emmett slowly lowered the phone. Sasha stared. You're the janitor." "The cannula," Tobias said again, and this time his voice was quiet, flat, certain, the way a person sounds when they are not asking. "If you don't fix the flow rate in the next 2 minutes, the air-to-blood ratio in the oxygenator is going to shift and you'll be looking at an embolism on top of everything else you're already dealing with." Another beep from the machine, long this time, sustained. Sasha looked at Emmett. Emmett looked at Tobias. Tobias looked at the machine. And then, because there was no better option, and because something in his voice made argument feel like a luxury they couldn't afford, Sasha moved to the cannula and found the kink, and the beeping stopped, and the flow rate stabilized, and the room exhaled. That was how it started. What happened in the next 40 minutes is a matter of hospital record, though the official account is considerably more clinical than the truth. Dr. Fenwick had suffered a sudden cardiac event. The particular irony of a heart surgeon whose own heart gave out mid-operation was not lost on anyone, though no one said it out loud. The backup attending, a trauma surgeon named Dr. Miles Holt, arrived 8 minutes after the call. He was not a cardiothoracic surgeon. He said so himself, standing in the doorway in his civilian clothes, looking at the open chest on the table, and then at the 2 pale residents, and then at the young black man in a gray uniform who was standing at the bypass console like he had been stationed there. "Who is this?" Holt asked. "He works here," Emmett said carefully. "I can see that. That's not what I asked. His name is Tobias Annan," Sasha said. "He's maintenance." Holt looked at Tobias. "How old are you?" 23. "Have you done any surgical training?" "No. Any medical training at all?" Tobias paused. "Not officially." "Then what in the hell are you doing at that machine?" And Tobias told him. Not everything, not then, but enough. He explained the kink in the Venus line, explained how he had seen it from across the room, through the door window, explained what would have happened if it had gone uncorrected for another 90 seconds. He spoke in the specific, unhurried language of someone who understood the machinery, not as an outsider guessing, but as someone who had studied it until the understanding became part of how he saw the world. Holt listened. He was a man who had spent 20 years in trauma bays, where the only thing that mattered was whether the information in front of you was accurate. He had learned to evaluate information independent of its source. "Walk me through the current hemodynamics," he said finally. Tobias walked him through it. "And the patient's pre-op ejection fraction? 34%, based on what's in the chart outside." Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the patient on the table. Arthur Greer, a grandfather of 4 from Decatur, Georgia, who had driven 6 hours to have his mitral valve repaired by the best cardiothoracic surgeon in the region, and was now lying unconscious under fluorescent lights while his fate was being decided by a man who cleaned floors. "All right," Holt said. He stepped into the room and began scrubbing. "Tell me exactly what Fenwick had gotten through before he went down." There were people in that hospital who would have rather let Arthur Greer die than let Tobias Annan help save him. That is a hard sentence to write, but it is the truth. The hospital administrator on call that morning was a man named Gordon Shellworth. He arrived on the OR floor 20 minutes into the operation, summoned by a panicked call from the charge nurse, and the first thing he said when he was briefed on the situation was, "Get him out of there." He meant Tobias, the liability alone. Shellworth started. "The patient is on bypass," the charge nurse, a woman named Vera Pinkett, told him flatly. "We can't stop. Then get him away from the equipment." Dr. Holt has not asked him to step away. Shellworth looked through the OR window. He saw Tobias at the machine. He saw a young black man in a janitor's uniform standing at a surgical console, speaking to an attending physician, and the attending physician was listening and nodding and occasionally asking follow-up questions. He saw something that did not fit the category he had built for Tobias Annan the moment Tobias Annan was hired, and the dissonance of it made him angry in the way people get angry when the world refuses to be what they decided it was. "This is completely irregular," he said. "Yes," Vera agreed. "It is. He has no business being in there." He identified a Venus line obstruction that neither of the residents caught. Shellworth was quiet for a moment. "That's not possible." Vera looked at him. She had been a nurse for 31 years. She had seen a lot of things that administrators had decided were not possible. "Nevertheless," she said, Tobias Annan had grown up in East Point, a neighborhood southwest of Atlanta where ambition was not discouraged exactly, but it was understood to operate within certain boundaries. His mother, a woman named Lorraine Annan, had raised him alone after his father left when Tobias was 4, working double shifts as a home health aide until her knees gave out, then working a register at a grocery store after that. She had wanted Tobias to go to college. He had wanted that too. What he had not had was money. He had applied for financial aid and gotten some. He had worked nights at a car wash through high school and saved. He had gotten into a pre-med program at a state university and lasted 1 semester before the combination of tuition, rent, and the particular kind of financial stress that colonizes every corner of your thinking made it impossible to continue. He left school at 19 with a partial understanding of human physiology, a genuine love for medicine, and no clear path forward. He got the janitor job at Hargrove Memorial because it was the closest he could get to a hospital without a degree. What he did with that proximity was this. He read every textbook he could find at the library, every surgical manual, every journal article available online. He walked the hospital corridors on his breaks and listened. He learned which residents left their notes unsecured in the break room. He watched procedures through observation windows on the nights when no one told him not to. He memorized the names of instruments from the supply manifests he collected when restocking closets. He studied the cardiopulmonary bypass machine, the specific make and model used at Hargrove, by obtaining the technical manual from the manufacturer's website and reading it so many times that the document existed in his memory with nearly photographic fidelity. He was not doing any of this to become a hero. He was doing it because he had found the thing that made sense to him, and he was not willing to give it up just because the official pathways had closed. He had never told anyone at the hospital. He had learned early that certain kinds of knowledge, in certain kinds of people, in certain kinds of rooms, made other people uncomfortable in ways that were difficult to manage. So he mopped his floors and checked his supply inventories and kept his understanding of ventricular function to himself. Until 11:42 a.m. on a Thursday in November, when a man's heart stopped on the OR floor and Tobias Annan pushed open a door that was not meant for him. The operation took another 2 hours and 17 minutes. Holt performed the procedure. Tobias did not touch the patient. What he did was manage the bypass machine and talk, a steady, calm stream of observations, numbers, flags, questions, and what Holt did was operate while processing information from a source he had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. Twice during the procedure, Tobias identified something before the monitors alarmed. The first time, a shift in arterial pressure that preceded a brief arrhythmia. The second, a change in oxygenation levels that required a pump flow adjustment. Both times, Holt acted on what Tobias said in the 2 or 3 seconds before the equipment confirmed it, and both times the window Tobias had identified and the window the monitors eventually showed were identical. Emmett Burke, watching from the other side of the table, later told his wife that it felt like watching someone read the room differently than everyone else. Not faster, exactly, but from a different vantage point, like they had a map the rest of the people in the room were drawing in real time. When it was over, when Arthur Greer's sternum was wired back together and his chest was closed, and the numbers on every monitor were where they were supposed to be, Holt stepped back from the table and looked at Tobias and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn to read a bypass machine like that?" "The technical manual," Tobias said. "And I watched procedures. Through the windows." Holt nodded slowly. He was processing something. "How long have you been working here?" 2 years and 4 months, and before that you were, what?" "A pre-med dropout," Tobias said. "1 semester." Holt looked at the bypass console, then back at Tobias. "1 semester." "Yes, sir." The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of the monitors and the ventilator, and the particular silence of a space where something significant had just occurred, and no one was sure yet what it meant. "Go finish your shift," Holt said finally. "And don't go anywhere after. I need to make some calls." Gordon Shellworth tried to have Tobias fired that afternoon. He brought it to the chief of staff, a woman named Dr. Renata Moorfield, and laid out his case. Unauthorized access to a sterile surgical environment, interference with a medical procedure, liability exposure, regulatory violation. He had a list. He had printed it. Renata Moorfield listened to all of it. She was a 60-year-old woman who had fought for 35 years to occupy a chair that people kept trying to pull out from under her, and she had developed a very precise instrument for detecting when someone's concern about rules was a proxy for something else. "Did the patient survive?" she asked. "That's not the... Did the patient survive, Gordon?" Shellworth paused. "Yes." "Did the bypass machine function correctly throughout the procedure?" "Technically, yes. But did Dr. Holt at any point ask Tobias Annan to leave the room?" "No, but Holt shouldn't have allowed." "Was anyone harmed?" The list sat between them on the desk. Shellworth looked at it. It had seemed very solid when he printed it. "I'm going to review the R recording," Renata said. "I'm going to speak with Dr. Holt and both residents, and then I am going to make a decision about next steps." She looked at Shellworth over her glasses. "In the meantime, Tobias Annan remains employed. There was a woman named Cecilia Cross who had been a patient on the cardiac recovery floor the day of the surgery. She was recovering from her own procedure, 3 days post-op, and she had seen Tobias in the hallway that morning, had actually complained to the charge nurse that the janitor's cart was blocking the hall when she was trying to walk her laps. She had not said anything particularly unkind. She had just said that the hallway needed to be clear for patients, and that she had nearly walked into the mop bucket, and that someone should speak to whoever was in charge of the cleaning staff. She was in the family waiting area that evening, talking to her daughter, when she overheard two nurses at the nearby station speaking quietly about what had happened in OR3. She didn't catch every word, but she caught enough. She sat with it for a while, and then she walked to the nursing station and asked for the name of the young man who had been in the operating room that morning, and they told her, and she wrote it down on a piece of paper and put it in her pocket. The next morning, she asked one of the nurses to let her know when Tobias Annan was on the floor. She waited. Around 9:30, she saw him push his cart around the corner at the end of the hall. She called his name. He stopped, looked at her. She was a white woman in her late 60s, hospital gown, a V-pole, the cautious gait of someone still rebuilding strength. He had no reason to know who she was. He probably assumed he was about to be told something was wrong with the floor. "I'm Cecilia Cross," she said. "Yesterday morning I complained about your cart being in the hallway." Tobias waited. "I heard what happened in OR3, she said. "I heard what you did. I just helped with the equipment," he said. "That's not what I heard." He didn't answer. He had been saying as little as possible since the previous day, feeling the particular precariousness of a situation where he had done something that was simultaneously the right thing and a thing that could end his job, and possibly more. Cecilia Cross looked at him for a moment. "My husband had a bypass 12 years ago," she said. "I know what those machines sound like when something is wrong." She paused. "Thank you," she said, "for whoever you helped in there. Whoever they are, that's someone's person. You understand what I'm saying?" Tobias nodded. "I'm sorry about the cart," she said. She turned and made her slow way back down the hall, IV pole clicking beside her. Dr. Miles Holt made 3 phone calls that evening. The first was to Dr. Fenwick, who was in stable condition in the cardiac ICU 2 floors below where he had collapsed. Holt told him what had happened in OR3, including the part about Tobias. There was a long silence on the line. "Annan," Fenwick said finally. "Tobias Annan. You know him?" Another pause. "He used to watch procedures through the window on the 4th floor. I saw him there maybe a dozen times over the past year. I thought about calling security." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't." "Why not?" "I don't know," Fenwick said. "Something about the way he watched. Not curious, not gawking. He was studying. You could see it. Same posture I had in my first year of residency, when I was trying to memorize everything before it disappeared." Holt let that sit for a second. "He read your machine like someone who had operated one. He understood what he was looking at." "Yes." There was a long exhale on the line. "I should have talked to him," Fenwick said. "A year ago I saw him and I should have just talked to him." He paused. "How old is he?" 23. The second call Holt made was to a colleague at Emory University's medical school, a man who owed him a favor and sat on the admissions committee. The third call was to his own wife, who was a hospital attorney, and the conversation was long and quiet, and when it ended, she said, "You know this isn't going to be simple." "No," he said, "but you're going to do it anyway." "He saved a man's life," Holt said, "using a machine manual and observation windows. For 2 years." He paused. "What would you do?" Arthur Greer woke up the following afternoon. His daughter, a woman named Patrice Greer Wallace, was sitting beside the bed when he opened his eyes. She had driven up from Decatur the night before, arriving after midnight, and had not slept. She held his hand and told him the surgery had gone well, and that Dr. Fenwick was also being treated, and that everything was going to be okay. Arthur Greer was the kind of man who had worked 40 years in a textile mill and asked very little from the world except to be left in peace and to see his grandchildren grow up. He did not know who Tobias Annan was. He did not know how close things had come. But when Patrice eventually found out, when the full story filtered its way through the hospital staff, and eventually into her conversation with Vera Pinkett over a cup of coffee in the family lounge, she sat for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked where Tobias Annan was right now. Was he still working here? and Vera said yes, as far as she knew, and Patrice said she wanted to meet him. They arranged it the next day. A brief thing, in the hallway near the elevator bank on the third floor. Tobias came around the corner with his card and Vera introduced them, and Patrice looked at this young man, in his gray uniform, sneakers worn at the heel, a face that gave nothing away, and she said, "I understand you helped keep my father alive." "The doctors did the surgery," Tobias said. "That's not what I was told." He shifted slightly. He was still not entirely sure what was going to happen to him, legally or professionally, and he had been cautious all week about what he said and to whom. "I just helped with the machine," he said again. Patrice looked at him for a moment. She had her father's quality of stillness, the kind that comes not from passivity but from patience, from having learned that the most important things don't need to be rushed. "I want you to know something," she said. "Whatever happens next, with your job or anything else, I want you to know that my father is going to go home. He's going to watch my kids play in his yard this summer. He's going to grill terrible chicken on the 4th of July like he does every year and refuse to admit it needs more time." She paused. "That's because of you." Tobias looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "Tell him I said, congratulations," he said, "on going home." The story did not end neatly, because stories rarely do. There were weeks of administrative review. There were meetings with hospital counsel. Gordon Shellworth filed a formal complaint, which was reviewed and ultimately set aside when the OR recording and the testimony of Dr. Holt, Dr. Croft, and Dr. Burke established a clear account of what had occurred. Tobias was not fired. He was not disciplined. He was given a formal written commendation, which he accepted quietly, and filed somewhere he has not looked at since. Dr. Fenwick returned to work 4 months later. On his first day back, before he scrubbed in for any procedure, he walked down to the maintenance wing and knocked on the door of the supply room where Tobias was doing inventory. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. Tobias looked up from his clipboard. "For what?" "For watching you watch and not saying anything. For a year." Fenwick leaned against the doorframe. He was older looking than he'd been before. The way people get after a significant illness, something in the face reset, recalibrated. "I saw what you were doing. I should have done something about it. You didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything right either." He looked at Tobias. "I've spoken with Miles Holt and with Emory Admissions. There's a pathway, if you want it." He paused. "It won't be simple. Nothing has been," Tobias said. "No." Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "But you already knew how to read the machine. That's not nothing." He straightened. "Think about it. The offer doesn't have an expiration." He left. Tobias stood in the supply room for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. Outside, through the single window near the ceiling, the sky was the particular pale blue of a November morning, cold and clear and wide. He had spent a long time looking up at things through windows. It occurred to him, not for the first time, but perhaps more solidly than before, that windows were not the only way in. Arthur Greer went home in December. He grilled chicken on the 4th of July, overcooked it, according to his grandchildren, exactly as promised. He sent a card to Hargrove Memorial that said simply, "Thank you to everyone who helped. You know who you are." Tobias Annan began medical school at Emory the following fall. He was the oldest student in his incoming class by 3 years. On the first day, in the cadaver lab, when the professor asked if anyone had prior experience with anatomical study, every hand in the room went up in some tentative, qualified way, the way students do when they're not sure how to answer. Tobias kept his hand down. He did not need the professor to know what he knew. He just needed to learn what he didn't. Some people spend their whole lives looking through windows. Others when the door opens, even if it opens in a way nobody planned. Walk through. The question isn't whether the door will open for you. The question is whether you've been studying long enough to know what to do when it does.